Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Cosmos Society Online Open House series. I'm Keith DeStone, a research associate at the center, and our guest today is Dr. Rob Chaffee, assistant professor of classics at Bard College, and currently a fellow also at the center. Let's see. Rob is interested and has recently published on Greek prose fiction in the Roman imperial period, and his interests more broadly cover travel, ethnography, identity in the ancient world. I had the pleasure of working with Rob many years ago as teaching fellows for Greg Nadge's Heroes course at Harvard College. And let's see, today's conversation is a timely one. The topic is disease and social disorder, the plague narratives of Thucydides and Lucretius. And Rob will be leading us through these passages. So Rob, welcome. And as I promised, I'd like to ask you to begin by telling us a bit about what spurred your interest in pursuing classical studies.
Well, thank you, Keith. It's great to see you and be with you guys again, and thanks everyone for joining us. Yes, the dirty secret, as it were, of my interest in classics, I suppose, is that I found I couldn't really do anything else. When I was an undergraduate, I tried to take a course in something quote unquote useful, that is to say political science. And I found myself on the final exam writing about Socrates. And I received back the essay with the comment, something like this is all very interesting, but really has nothing to do with political science, B+, which I suppose is the way of great inflation. But in any case, it was a strong sign that my interests really couldn't get out of the ancient world. Which frankly, I think is sort of a world that is always informing me about how I think about the modern world. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. All right, take it away. And we have your slideshow, so just let us know when you want to start with that.
Okay, so what I might do, I'll just give you like a little bit of a preamble about sort of how I ended up at this topic and what I hope to do. As you probably could guess, Thucydides is not someone that I'm a kind of researcher in necessarily, but it's a text that I've read a lot over the years and in these moments especially found myself coming back to because it seemed sort of inescapable. So what I sort of thought we could do would be to talk a bit about Thucydides, and then Lucretius, as you probably saw, has a really kind of close response to Thucydides, almost verbatim in places, but it's put in a very different context. And so that might be something that we might turn to at the end to think a little bit about why Lucretius comes back to Thucydides about 450 years later, or sorry, about 350 years later. To just get us started, what I thought I might do is to provide just a bit of context for the history of the Peloponnesian War, for what's happening, for Pericles' place in it. And then we might talk a little bit about the stretch of text that I had you guys read, if that makes sense. So I'm gonna try to, I hope, successfully share some slides, and that way, as the conversation goes, I have some passages up with sort of Greek words interspersed that we could take a look at. So,
great. Yeah, I forgot that you're doing your own sharing this time.
Well, I will try.
Very independent.
If I fail, you guys are going to back me up.
Totally.
So anyway, this is the title. I'm happy, I should say also, that if after our conversation you want to send me an email, I'd be delighted to hear from you. So what I thought I might do is just give you a little bit of historical background. If you know the kind of history of the 5th century, this I hope will all be things that you know. And if I've made some glaring error, because I normally work in fiction, not facts, let me know. So the person that we're kind of interested in a way, who unites the passages that we read in Thucydides, is this guy named Pericles. And I have a sort of bronze copy of a marble copy of a bronze statue of him, so you get a sense of what he looked like. He's a very interesting figure for Thucydides because he's really coming to power at the time of the Peloponnesian War. And so just a few things to sort of know about him. There's a kind of question of when he really became influential in Athens, but the strongest sort of moment really is in the 440s BC, so about 10 years before the history begins. There's this guy named Thucydides, not our author, but perhaps a relative who is ostracized, that left a kind of power vacuum. And so this guy Pericles really stepped into it. He's very famous for buildings. And so the kind of Athens that you think of as typical of being the 5th century, a lot is this so-called Periclean building program. And he got the money for it in large part because of something called the Delian League, which I decided we would not talk about in detail. But after the Persian War, Athens became the kind of central focus of a bunch of allies. And they had a treasury on the island of Delos, which is like way, way out in the Aegean Sea in the middle of the Cyclades. And as a result of being the head of the Delian League, Athens also had a lot of money, which they used in part to build some buildings. So this is just some of the background. Pericles was a very famous orator. He was very effective at using the assembly. And some of his speeches actually are explicit models for people like John F. Kennedy. And in part, he led Athens, the sort of part that's really relevant is that he was in charge of Athens effectively during the beginning years of the Peloponnesian War until his death in about 429. Now, you might wonder what the Peloponnesian War is. Sorry, I'm just giving you this background. It's a conflict between Athens and its allies, some of which I think were more willing than others, and Sparta, which was on the Peloponnese of Greece. And this is like a really schematic map. But just to give you a sense that if you think about the kind of history of Greece, that there's the kind of Trojan War, which is in the Iliad and very famous. There's the Persian War, which is between essentially this kind of unified idea of Greece and Persia. And then the Peloponnesian War is a much closer war between two much, much, much more tightly integrated cities. And Thucydides is, of course, eager to tell you that it's like the most important war in history, it's the biggest war, etc. But it was certainly devastating, especially if you're an Athenian. And it lasted for about 30 years. To give you just a sense of Pericles and Thucydides, the part you're reading is almost all of the narrative about Pericles. He shows up earlier, especially in book 1, and even earlier in book 2, but the really densest reference is the part that you have here. So if you think that there's like sort of a whole bunch of Pericles story that you're missing, it's true you're missing some of it, but this is a lot of it. And the plague is a really important part of it. So far, so good. Just checking. Okay. So before I kind of launch into our discussion, there's been a lot of writing about the role of classics in the ancient world in helping to understand our present moment, including this piece on a online journal called Eidolon, which some of you might know. And it's a bit provocative, and I sort of want to read this to you as a kind of warning about kind of what we should be careful about what we're doing, I think, or maybe make us think a little bit about like what virtue there is in the ancient world. And so this paragraph I thought really spoke to this. So the author says, in my very first Eidolon article, I argued against comparison for comparison's sake, my rationale being that it is at its worst disrespectful. This feels truer than ever to me. It can be productive to think about a modern event to an ancient one. Conversely, it can be productive to acknowledge that some modern events lack ancient parallels, because then you can stop looking for similarities and start confronting the very real, swiftly escalating situation that you and many others are trapped in. I'm not saying that classicists have nothing to contribute here, but honestly, we don't have that much to contribute here just because there were plagues in antiquity too. And the person says, I suspect that so many of the hot takes rely on misreadings precisely because the actual texts reveal that those plagues and this plague don't have a lot in common. This time, we may want to yield the floor to other experts, such as epidemiologists or historians of science. And I'm not sort of putting this here, A, to say that our discussion is pointless, or B, that this article is wrong. But I think it's worth remembering that when we're thinking about the ancient world, it's an important lens for us, and it's something that I care deeply about, but also to acknowledge that it's not identical to our modern moment. And so as much as we can, I hope we can talk about the ancient passages and think about them without sort of forcing them to kind of sort of map on to the modern situation that we find ourselves in. So that being said, I thought there might be sort of two questions that would really orient our discussion. One is, what happens to ancient societies in the face of devastating disease, and how do ancient authors explain such diseases? And I thought that Thucydides would be very useful for this because his history sort of begins, or the part of the history you read begins in this moment of just absolute sort of glory for Athens, right? Where Pericles is sort of at his apex. And the plague comes right after this moment where Pericles talks about how fantastic Athens is, and in many ways seems to sort of change everything. And so what I thought we might do is to talk a little bit about how it changes everything, what it means, and sort of what we think is going on in this section of the history, if that makes sense. And I thought this might be a good moment to see if you guys have some reactions to the passages that we read, some reactions especially to the plague, some reactions to Pericles, if that's fair.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I'm trying to see.
Does anyone? Let's see. Anne, I saw that you said something. You had your hand up, maybe?
Yes. Hi. Thank you. I'm not sure that what I'm going to say is going to be particularly helpful, because the one thing that struck me when I read these were parallels with today. I'm English. You probably know that our Prime Minister is a classicist, or was. And the first thing he did was build walls. And the next thing he did was have a plague to deal with. That was my reaction to what I read.
And so, I mean, I don't mean to say that this is irrelevant to today, but I think you're right to see that one thing that's really interesting about Thucydides to me, I think, is that the plague narrative appears to be speaking to political concerns in Athens, right? That one of the really striking things, and I had a very interesting conversation by email by someone called Terry Walsh, who is a classics teacher in Britain. And his point, or question, which I think is my question too, is why does the plague come right after Pericles' funeral oration? Why at that moment, like what are we supposed to make from that juxtaposition? And that might speak a little bit to your point, Anne, right? Like, do you see that there's something, would you say that there's something productive or unproductive in that juxtaposition?
I don't know. One thing that strikes me when I read a lot of the classics is that these were written by writers for a purpose. And that purpose may not be concerned with the reality at the time, but it might be a lot more to do with the points that they were trying to make. And possibly Thucydides thought, now what's important about Pericles? Well, one is the funeral oration and the other is the plague. And so it was more about how you construct a narrative than it was about the objective reality of what went on.
So one of the interesting things about this that you've raised is a kind of question that people often ask about Thucydides. One thing that I think you might have noticed in the history is it feels very authoritative, if that's fair to say. And Thucydides himself is really explicit early in the history that he has done the most work to find the most facts. But he does say something curious about the speeches. Which might be sort of interesting to sort of think in the opposite direction, which is he says that the speeches were hard to record in the moment because he wasn't always there and he didn't have a tape recorder. And so he tried to get them as close as possible to what they were like. And so one response to that might be to say, look, like Thucydides was really trying his best. He's just trying to give us the facts. Whatever parallels we see are just historical parallels. Another response might be to say that because Thucydides says this, it's a little bit unusual. And we might think that the language of the speeches is not necessarily precisely the language that Pericles used. And we might do something with that. And we might wonder if there's sort of interesting correspondences. And so in this respect, we might think that there's something like of the gist, but the kind of particularities of Pericles' speech are reflected or not reflected in the funeral oration. If that helps a bit. Are there other reactions? I saw one of you sort of taking notes.
Yes. Yes. If I was struck in 6510, Thucydides says that it was in name a state democratical, but in fact a government of the principal man. So I think it is important to view how Thucydides built his narration, because I think there's something in that sentence that implies some hubris maybe of Pericles, and because of that we can think if this text is built with a tragical model in mind.
No, I think that's a fantastic way of thinking about this. To how should we understand this narrative? And so it sounds to me that you see a kind of I use the term rise and fall, which Terry Walsh pointed out to me is not totally fair because Pericles has already risen, but maybe sort of apex and fall, right? That we see a great moment and a kind of fall, and we might ask a little bit about the kind of causes and relationships. And there's a few ways in which we might look at that. I might just sort of make a little agenda because I saw a few other hands, and we might look at a couple passages after that.
I may be sort of on a minority here, but I think Thucydides' account is very timely and relevant to present time. You know, this is an eyewitness account. And just because scholars have had trouble relating it to diseases that were known up until now, it doesn't mean that he was making anything up. And we're finding with this COVID-19 comorbidities that sound very close to what Thucydides is talking about. Like if you were already sick, this gave you the rest of it, you know? So I think it deserves careful study, and I think the whole issue of secular pandemics, plagues, and so forth is an understudied subject, and I think it would be interesting to let's not say either or. Let's have both. Let's do historical study. Let's look at these texts. I mean, this is Thucydides is particularly interesting because he even says he suffered it himself. So he knew it from the inside out. He saw people dying of it, getting sick from it. He describes an etiology that actually sounds rather close to COVID-19 with, you know, follow on and comorbidities and secondary infections and maybe gangrene or whatever else. They study the history, but study the epidemiology. You know, let's learn from Racaniello and the other people who are on the front lines of virology, immunology, and Thucydides deals with immunology. I mean, talking about if you got it once, you didn't get it again, or if you did, you died from it. So it's a very interesting text, and I think those who want to poo-poo it are really wrong.
Well, I clearly I think it's a useful text, so thank you. I think Bill, did I see your hand too? And so yeah. After you, maybe we'll take a look at a few passages.
It always surprises me that generally in ancient writing, when there's a plague, it's a response from the gods for something that has been done by maybe one person, but affects the whole community. And following up with Maria's comment is Pericles has raised the city to the point of hubris. And I wonder if you thought about that, about what crime the Athenians committed to get this plague.
So I think you both have raised something really interesting, which is that a lot of the texts that I think you guys have been reading and discussing have two kind of features of plagues, right? One is the divine causation of plagues, often Apollo. So if you think of the beginning of the Iliad, right, there's a very clear cause and effect between Agamemnon's misbehavior towards a priest of Apollo and Apollo's revenge by sending a plague. The word in Greek there is nosos, which is the word that you'll see that Thucydides uses throughout. And so on the one hand, there's this kind of Greek tradition, basically, that plagues are divinely caused. And you can look at Oedipus Tyrannos, too, where there's a sense that the plague at the beginning of the play suggests that there's something really wrong with the city's reader. One very interesting feature of Thucydides, and it's one that people have argued about. And so on I put a document with some bibliography. There's an article by someone named Barbara Keitel, I think, about this, is that Thucydides doesn't explicitly say exactly that Apollo caused the plague. There's a couple of moments where he comes close, including the oracle passage. And so one question is sort of, in the absence of Thucydides, in the absence of an explicit cause for the plague, right? Thucydides says, I'm not going to tell you how the plague came about. I'm going to leave that to others. I just want to record the symptoms, which is very unusual for Thucydides. He's all about causation. We have to wonder a little bit about what we're supposed to do with this. And I think the absence of explanation invites some of the explanations maybe that you're suggesting, that there's a way in which we're invited to think like, is this a comment on the behavior of Athens? To what extent should we read it in that way? And there's one passage that might speak to a number of your concerns, which is, I think, 252. And we might read that together. Before we do that, I realized I just left out a couple of facts about the plague that might be worth knowing, which is that basically everyone in Athens, we think, according to epidemiology, got it. And maybe as many as a quarter of the people died, just to give you a sense of the kind of totality of the destruction. But let's look at this passage here, which is, I think, should be on my slide. And so I'll just read this to you, and I maybe tell you a little bit about sort of why I thought it might be relevant, and here's some reactions. I just have to minimize you all. So he begins by saying, an aggravation of the existing calamity was the influx from the country into the city. And this was especially felt by the new arrivals. And so Pericles had actually told everyone from the countryside to come into the city because he was afraid that the Peloponnesians, that is to say the Spartans, would attack them. So the city was really cramped together. As there were no houses to receive them, they had to be lodged at the hot season of the year in stifling cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. The bodies of the dying, the necros, men lay upon one another, and half-dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered round all the fountains in their longing for water. The sacred places also in which they had quartered themselves were full of corpses, necroi, of persons that had died there, just as they were. For as the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what was to become of them, became utterly careless of everything, whether sacred, hieros, or profane, hosios. All the burial rites, nomos, before in use, were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many, from want of the proper appliances, through so many of their friends having died already, had recourse to the most shameless sepultures. Sometimes getting the start of those who had raised a pile, they threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pyre and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse, necros, which they were carrying, on top of another that was birthing, and so went off. So I just thought I would sort of, I thought that spoke to some of our concerns, right? That this is a little bit about kind of what it is like to experience the plague. And also I think it tells you a little bit about the kind of Athenian response perhaps, and it might look a little bit back. Are there anything that stood out to you guys in that? Yeah.
Well, obviously it's been said many times, but the ease with which this beautiful social order and cultural order broke down under the strain of this disease, of which they really didn't understand.
Yeah, and I also saw your hand, and then I have a sort of follow-up question. Sorry, I think that was, yes.
I'm sorry. Yes, exactly. Getting back to that, I think and I think I answer now a previous question as well. What we find, I think very interesting. What I find very interesting is that at this moment, Thucydides acknowledged the fact that people, in a way, distanced themselves from anything divine. The divinity didn't play a role anymore. The funeral rites were not as important because pragmatism was, let's say, the key factor to how they deal with the plague. And this answers for me the question about the hybris and why, and whether this was a response to their hybris, because I think by explicitly saying that the Athenians didn't care anymore about the gods, didn't care about the temples, they didn't attend any of the previous things, they were off, and that means that somehow they distinguished between being, let's say, religious attentive and pragmatic, how to deal with the problem. If I may add, I wanted to say before, and perhaps it's relevant, I find the placement of this passage to be, let's say, a logical response to the glorification coming after the oration, the funeral oration, the glorification as a sign of idealism, and now he comes with realism, pragmatism. And and what happens is the worst punishment is, apart from the deaths, obviously, and the destruction, is the anomia. How is it possible from this high ideal, from this perfect society, that we come in a situation where the fear of God and the laws of the people do not matter anymore? And concluding, I would say that he says it all the time. I write this so we have a kind of a knowledge when it happens again, so it might not happen again. It's general. We gain knowledge, we add to our experience. And this is the experience of the Athenians, is holistic. It has glory, but it has this downfall as well. Thank you very much for your time.
No. This so you've raised something which is really interesting that I want to also hear from you. But one thing that I think is very, very interesting is a question about cause and effect, right? So one of the things you've identified, which is sort of striking, is that we've asked this question about how do we understand the causality of how do we understand the coming of the plague? Is it a kind of divine punishment? Is it a sort of accident of nature, which is sort of in the background to, I think, some of our questions, maybe the idea of a kind of secular plague? And one question is that we see that in the presence of the plague, the divine is abandoned. And is that a cause or is that an effect, might be one question we might ask. A second question we might ask about the juxtaposition is Thucydides is famous for quote unquote paired speeches. And so speeches that are given at distances in the text might seem to speak to each other. And should we see this plague as a kind of example of a kind of pairing? Is there a way in which the plague is sort of answering or responding to what's come before? And I think, Georgia, your point suggests that maybe it is. And so I saw maybe one more hand. Yes.
Yes, divine is abandoned, but this abandonment is not, okay, we are not believing in gods. It's you have to abandon. Funeral rites are not observed. It's you care about the funeral rites, but you cannot observe them. And this is happening now. That's why it is relevant. And going back to previous question, we are reading this text because to me, we cannot believe that this is happening to us. How come, we are so developed, so many things we have, but we cannot observe our funeral rites right now. We cannot go to hospital to our loved ones. And we are trying to make sense of what's happening to us now through perhaps reading some old texts. And this has so many aspects. We have psychological aspects, medical aspects. So everybody, I think, will come and put their opinions and share their opinions. And I think it's very useful that we are reading this text. Thank you.
No, thank you. I mean, so one thing that the reason actually that I began to think about Thucydides is something that you just said, which I was so struck when I started to read the stories in Italy about how funerals were unable to be held, partly because of the kind of number of people who'd passed away, but also just because of the danger. And it struck me that one of the really kind of continuities, whether or not we're supposed to make a causal connection or not, is this moment in Thucydides, where in essence, funeral rites also are suspended, some of the sort of most basic rites. And this passage I find very powerful in part for all the reasons you're suggesting, right? That we're seeing a moment in which everything that sort of had ordered Athenian society no longer works. The sort of religiosity that we assume Athens was sort of using all the time is sort of abandoned. Thucydides, just as a footnote, is notoriously skeptical about the gods. So whenever he talks about the gods, there's something going on He doesn't say, I'm skeptical about the gods, but the number of gods in this text is very, very small, and he's very sort of suspicious of divine causation. And so here to kind of abandon the religiosity of Athens and the sort of ritual practice is for him like a very striking observation, and two, I think a really remarkable moment. The other thing, which is more of a kind of literary than a human point, which I find so interesting, is that we've been making kind of implicit comparisons between the funeral oration, the beauty of Athens that Pericles sort of articulates, and this passage. And one of the things that strikes me is that at this moment in Athens, what Pericles did, which was to give a funeral oration, is no longer possible. That at this moment, society has so transformed itself so rapidly and so profoundly that the very kind of vehicle that Pericles had for praising Athens is denied, which is to say the funeral. And that, I think, was, to me, sort of opens up another question, which is that if we are to sort of understand in Thucydides the plague as a kind of answer to a response, we might begin to think in those terms, right? That maybe in a way, that maybe this is an example of kind of Athens has made a mistake and they're being punished by the gods. But maybe this is also a kind of response to Pericles, or this plague represents a kind of ways in which the world of nature sort of respond. It struck me that there's like a few other moments of response, and that might kind of open up a sort of discussion about how we understand this. And so I might just jump to a different slide. Sorry. And so I just made a series of connections. One very striking moment is that at the end of Pericles' funeral oration, he says this, or not in the end, and near the end. So if you remember in the funeral oration, it's technically a funeral oration, but the middle part is this like massive praise of Athens. And so he says in conclusion of his praise of Athens, I say that this whole city is an example, a paideusis, which is literally an education for Greece. And it seems to me that each person among us has a body that is self-sufficient, a soma autarches, for all kinds of conduct with the most versatile grace. This is no boast tossed out for the present moment in words alone. Rather, it is a truth proven in our actions. The power of our city, which we have acquired from our habits and our way of life, proves this. For Athens alone of the cities now in existence is greater than its reputation, and Athens alone gives no reasons for its subjects to question its rights to rule. So far this sounds kind of extraordinary, right? This is a kind of utmost praise of Athens. Each individual is totally self-sufficient. Athens is it's not just boasting, but it's proving its truth in words. And Athens is so powerful and so extraordinary that no one asks whether or not they can rule. And there's a very precise verbal parallel to parts of this passage in the funeral oration, in the plague narrative, which is to say that just before the passage we read, in the kind of description of the disease, Thucydides says this: it was clear that no body, soma, whether it was weak or strong, was sufficient autarches against the plague, which seized everyone cared for by every regiment. And it strikes me that one of the interesting things about that correspondence is that this language is so precisely mirroring that in a way the kind of plague, however we understand the causality, as many of you have noticed, is actually undoing the very picture of Athens that Pericles has painted. There's a couple of other sort of moments that, if to sort of just pursue this, that might be worth just pointing out. One is what I just sort of mentioned, this idea that the funeral oration is in fact a custom of their ancestors, and that the funeral oration that couldn't occur. That's the first point. And then the second point, which is also interesting, is there's this very funny verb in Thucydides that is only used twice called aphedo. And it means to be unsparing. And again, this is a case where the funeral oration and the plague seem to be in dialogue with one another. So this is the second passage on my slide. For it is not the miserable that would most justly be unsparing of their lives. These have nothing to hope for. It is rather they to whom continued life may bring reverses as yet unknown, and to whom a fall, if it came, would be most tremendous in its consequences. And so at this moment, Pericles is talking about the sacrifice that is made by the people who have perished among the first dead in the war, and how it's a greater sacrifice if your life is sort of promises to be fantastic, if you are willing to give your life. And then this is what Pericles, the plague narrative has. And it's very, very interesting. It's when it's talking about this really extraordinary passage where people can't even go to visit their relatives. And it says, honor made them unsparing, a phaedo of themselves in their attendance in their friends' houses. So I just sort of wanted to kind of share a few of those correspondences to sort of push forward a little bit our discussion, or to sort of charge it up about how we understand the relationship between the two. So far, many of you, I think, are, just to get a sort of sampling of what you said, a lot of you, I think, seem to be reading this through the lens of tragedy, which is to say that there's a kind of thing that Athens has done wrong and it's been punished. Is that true of everyone else? Or are there other ways of sort of understanding this connection? Bill, you were shaking your head. Oh, I see a hand down. Sorry, I can't figure out what the names are, but there's someone in a white and black sweater that I saw, and then maybe Bill.
Let's see, Kelly, was that you or Elen? Elen, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think Bill raised his hand before me.
Oh, okay, sorry. So maybe
Bill?
I was just going to say that it's difficult to ignore. There's a strong tradition of blaming plagues on the gods. I wouldn't say even it's all of Greek literature up to this point. And as he blatantly ignores it, it emphasizes the point. You know, the very absence of him saying anything. Maybe he doesn't want to offend the city when he writes it. Maybe he thinks there's some mystery, but it can't be ignored.
Mm. So you're kind of, just to kind of summarize, your view is that if we sort of see the history of Greek literature, we are conditioned to think that plagues come from the gods. And that Thucydides' sort of reluctance to talk about it maybe is just a sort of desire to be polite, in a sense. Just to sort of, or...
Pausanias is famous for refusing to speak about mysteries or things uncomfortable. Either he doesn't want to offend Athenians, or he's got some mystery, or, I mean, the topic has to be addressed. It's always addressed in Greek literature. This is the first time it's not.
Yeah, no, I think this is really important. So that's excellent. And so, Aline?
Yes, I was just wondering about this, the government, the time of Thucydides. You know, the absence of burial rites. Okay, now it's our governments in the most of countries that prohibits. You know, they prohibit the burials. So the things come from the government. Okay, but it seems like during the plague, there was, Thucydides doesn't mention anything coming from the government to try to control the plague. So what was done by the government at that time in Athens?
So I think you've raised a kind of really interesting point, which is that to kind of move from causation to effect, at the current moment, many of the kind of restrictions that are happening are essentially public health restrictions, which is to say that in a sense, the reason that I'm in my house and not going out of my house is because the government tells me not to go out of my house. And the reason for the suspension of many of the things that kind of are quote unquote normal in society is because the governments have told us to do that. And you sort of put your finger on something very interesting about the plague narrative of Thucydides, which is that kind of the opposite, that there really isn't a kind of top-down sort of influence preventing people from doing anything. It's actually that people are just no longer obeying their customs or their laws. One very interesting term, which I didn't gloss, I think, in that passage, is this term nomos, which you might have encountered, N-O-M-O-S. Which has two meanings in Greek, and you sort of jog my memory about it. One is that it's the normal term in Athens for law, which is to say that, like, if you do something that's sort of paranormal, contrary to the law, it's illegal. It's where we get paranormal. But it's also, in the way of paranormal, a kind of word that suggests custom and tradition. And one of the things that appears to be happening in the plague narrative, which is so striking, is that we see a sort of breakdown of custom and tradition that is so strong in the beginning that Pericles' funeral oration is an act of custom. It's a traditional custom. All the time he's praising the ancestors. And in the plague, some of the things that we notice are not actually laws. They're not actually customs, but they're actually people violating them. There are people rejecting them, and there are people sort of deciding to take things into their own hands.
If I may, I think the parallel with tragedy is maybe best seen in Thucydides is pointing out hamartia generally of the Athenians, how they really blew the war. The Spartans actually showed more common sense than the Athenians, moving away from where the sick and dying were located. They terminated the invasion because they didn't want to be infected. And I put a note there in the chat about how he's looking with a very synoptic view of the whole war, looking forward to the huge mistake that the Athenians made with their Sicilian misadventure. So I don't know if Aristotle thought up the idea of hamartia as being an original thing, but you see Thucydides uses the word hamarton, and I think there is a strong parallel with tragedy, apart from the God-sent plagues of Oedipus, which was presumably written about the same time. Anyway, thank you.
No, thank you. I see some other hands, and then maybe we'll hear from you, and then, yeah, so, sorry, I'm unable to get your names on the screen, so maybe Keith, I can have you do the delegating.
Sure, yeah, I've got everyone in a couple of separate areas, so I'll have to scroll through here. Okay. Let's see. Ian, I see you've got your hand up, and Maria and George also.
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. One, as Mary Eugenia mentioned, Thucydides' comments that rather than a democracy, Athens was really under the rule of one man, Pericles. And Pericles, produced the massive building program, the glory of Athens. And yet it's his strategic decisions that cause all the rural population to come into the city, which Thucydides indicates, made the plague much worse. And I mean, military historians have been arguing about Pericles' strategy for hundreds of years, but I think that at least half the people consider that it was entirely misguided, that a naval power can never beat a land power unless it engages in land. And they cite the Napoleonic Wars with Britain as an example, where the British had to organize a coalition and eventually fight the French directly. Similarly, World War II, the US and Britain were essentially naval powers that had to essentially invade the continent to come to grips with the Nazis. So ultimately, Thucydides, I don't know if he mentions it, but the strategy which Pericles initiates is possibly faulty from the beginning and leads Athens down this terrible path.
So this is super interesting. I should confess that I'm not in any way competent as a military historian, as my political science class would say, but this is super, super interesting. Are there some other comments? I think one thing we might do after this is move to Pericles' sort of response to all this, if that might be helpful. But I see two other hands at least. But Keith, again.
Yeah, Maria, can you go ahead here. I'll unmute you, Maria.
Is it me or Maria Eugenia?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maria Eugenia was the one I was seeing.
And then I can weigh in
Okay.
after Maria Eugenia.
Okay, perfect.
A comment. So, I think this text also stages the antagonism between physis and nomos. That it was a discussion between the sophists and Plato or other philosophers, and it enforces the idea that the finitude of the human being facing that physis, and that can link to Lucretius.
Yes, and so this is excellent. So we will, I will just I'll make like a little sort of marker that we should kind of make sure we get to Lucretius at the end. But so far there's a kind of, just to sort of summarize, there are essentially three views I think that you guys have expressed about how to understand this. And I think the kind of multiplicity of views is a sign of the richness of the text. So one is a kind of, I would say, quasi-divine view or explicitly divine view, where you sort of see the plague as a kind of response by the gods to the behavior of Athens, whether that's misbehavior in the past, whether that's kind of intellectual or sort of democratic mistakes, that in a sense that we should understand this as a divine punishment. A second view, which is I think related to the kind of mistake view, is a view of a mistake of military strategy. And so that this might be a kind of slightly more realpolitik view, in the sense that it's about kind of Athens making a strategic error which has maybe natural/divine consequences. And then I think a third view, all of which sort of have similar terms, which you've just identified, Maria, is that there's a kind of contest in this text between sort of the powers of law, custom, and intellect to order the world, and the ability of nature to destroy that ordering. And I wouldn't say that any of these views are mutually exclusive, but I'm just trying to summarize some of the kind of interpretive lenses that we've brought to bear so far. So Maria, the other Maria, you were going to say something, right?
Yes, thank you very much. I think that the texts that you chose really are fascinating in many ways. Let me start by commenting on the concluding paragraph of this idol on peace that you presented us. Okay, I fully understand that it is the time of the immunologists and epidemiologists to take over, but let us not forget that also, okay, the epidemiologists and immunologists will do their part, but it is also, I think, in order to deal with this probably first pandemic of the 21st century after, the Spanish influenza, is to apply interdisciplinarity. So in that sense, and through that lens, I think that studying ancient texts, and by ancient, I also include, for example, medieval texts, Byzantine texts, I think it's really very useful, because we would like to see how other people reacted, no matter whether the author has an agenda, a literary agenda, or a political agenda, or a religious agenda. I think we are able to uncover certain nuances. To give you an example, okay, Thucydides records the first pandemic, real pandemic, although the first we know it's in Iliad Book 1. Okay, let's say that in Iliad Book 1 we have the first literary or fictional pandemic. However, in medieval texts, and especially in Byzantine texts, we have other plagues. For example, one famous example is the Justinianic plague. We know, for example, that this is also a plague that in a way led to a societal collapse. we know, for example, that people reacted in different ways. Another example, let me now move you like almost 250 years before, was the plague in Alexandria. That, for example, Eusebius records, where he said that, for example, the first Christians, how they reacted, how the pagans reacted. And so what it's really meaningful, what we could extrapolate, it's of course social behaviors, how the author records all these incidents, and of course how we can combine them. I don't know if we can combine them also with some archaeological data. Okay, so in terms of interdisciplinarity, I think that what you really, this matter that you brought is really useful, because we need this interdisciplinarity, and this is very, and it's very meaningful to study ancient texts. Not only the texts themselves, but also in a way that we should bring other information together. Now, in terms of the Thucydides text, personally, I think that it is true that maybe Thucydides in a way presents, although I believe I'm of another opinion, Thucydides might allow some kind of divine interference. But for me, I think he's very exact and very accurate in the way he describes the plague. We are certainly sure that he described it in a purely Hippocratic way, because Hippocrates laid down the foundations of medicine. So for me, whenever I read this passage, I can read the underlying, that Hippocrates is underlying this passage. This is my overall reaction to what we've said so far.
No, I appreciate it. I feel bad. I think, do you want to say something very quickly? Sorry,
I'm so sorry, just something very quickly because of the causation theories, to the causation theories. I think it's very striking that Thucydides, who's all through his books, is always saying aition en. Suddenly he says explicitly, I'm not a let for a doctor, a physician, or somebody else to talk about the causes, but I will just describe the course and the symptoms. And by doing that, he comes really down to the human being and the suffering of the body, in opposition to Lucretius, who is distant from that all.
No, so I think I'm just aware that we don't have a huge amount of time. So thank you so much for all of your comments. We might just sort of move a little bit ahead. Just a couple of things that if you want to follow up, if you're interested in the kind of intellectual and medical context of the 5th century, Rosalind Thomas, who I think I put her piece on the bibliography, is really the expert in all of this. And she did a very nice piece in the Oxford Companion to Thucydides that came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago about that. I think you're raising some really interesting points. That one is that I think the kind of the ambiguity that Thucydides leaves about causation to focus on suffering, I think allows all of these different interpretations of the cause. It also, I think, suggests that maybe in our text he's sort of inviting us to think not only to speculate about the cause, but also to focus on its effects and to focus on what happens when this unexpected thing happens. And you can see that especially in the final speech of Pericles, which I don't think we have time to talk a lot about, but you see a very different figure who suddenly reacts to this sort of unexpected catastrophe quite defensively. And I just counted these statistics, which I think are really striking about Pericles' speech, and we won't spend a lot of time on them, but I counted them, so I thought I would share them, which is that if you check the way that Pericles uses language, it's extraordinarily different in the two speeches. In the first speech, the funeral oration, he uses we maybe almost twice as often as he uses the terms I and you. In the second speech, whatever the cause, whether this is a sort of divine cause, whether this is an accident of nature, whether it's something in between, he's so distant from the Athenians that he so rarely uses we. and that the ratio there is something like, I don't know, like 7 to 1. It's just a sort of extraordinary difference in the effect that the plague has had on his relationship with the people, and the effect that the kind of, essentially the way in which these sort of social bonds have been torn apart. And I'm not sure there's an answer to our situation here, but I think there's something really powerful to see about this, and something really powerful to see about the profound effect that it has on society and on its relationship with its leaders. One thing that I think has almost come up that I want to sort of share, because it's one of my favorite books, even if it goes a little bit too far.
Let me just interrupt here to say that we can totally go for a few extra minutes.
Okay.
As the conversation needs, so don't worry about that, Rob.
Okay, well, I'll sort of share this quickly, and then this might be a good invitation to move to Thucydides. There's a very old but interesting book by someone called Adam Perry called Logos and Ergon and Thucydides. And those of you who have been in the edX Heroes course might know a little bit about Milman Perry, who's a very famous Homerist about the oral formulaic theory. And Adam Perry's view, people don't really buy into because it's a bit too schematic. But his view essentially is that Thucydides has a strong opposition between the faculties of language and the mind and the realities of the world, which is a little bit like what I think Maria said about Phusis and Namos. And that's sort of why I brought it in. And so it struck me that in another way maybe of thinking about this stretch, or another kind of factor that's going on in the stretch, is that there's a kind of competition between the efforts of essentially the intellect, the language, leadership, law, and custom to cope with a situation that is essentially natural and essentially belongs to the world of fact and deed. And however we see the causation, there's a mismatch between what we say in language, what we try to affect with our mind, and what actually happens. And we see that partly in the way that the word for word the plague undoes the funeral oration. We see it partly in the way that Pericles' speech, the way that he uses language, has to change in response to the realities of the world. I'm not saying that this is a right interpretation as opposed to other interpretations, but it just struck me that this was like a very powerful lens that Adam Perry provided, even though I think it's maybe not the only lens. Maria, you look like you're eager to say something, or are you? Sorry, I'm an over eager caller honor in real life, and I've turned this into Zoom.
Yeah. So not to marry you again. To me, no. I fully agree with what you said. I hope that what I brought into our discussion allowed us to see, let's say, the overview and how profound this text is.
No, absolutely.
So and also, as I told you, when I see a Hippocratic, the accuracy of his description, or his tendency to record this with an accuracy, is because I think Hippocrates himself presents us with a holistic view of the human body. I mean, he did not dissect the human body like we do nowadays in modern medicine.
No, absolutely.
Hippocrates was the first that introduced what we nowadays call environmental medicine, the holistic overview of the human body, about mental health. So, and it's what has been said, it has to do with the human being and the connection of the human being with the environment this being lives in, including animals and everything. It's like a cycle.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it suggests that maybe Hippocrates should be next on the syllabus for these open houses or in the future. And I didn't mean to suggest that that wasn't a sort of viable way to go forward. It's Hippocrates, I just am sort of outside of my area of expertise. If it's okay, I don't want to keep you longer than your appointed time, but I suppose one way to kind of close might just be to note what happens with Lucretius 350 years later. I have a kind of slide that reviews some of the things about Lucretius that I think you may know or I may have sort of noted. But one of the really striking things about Lucretius, as opposed to all of the kind of Greek explanations for plagues that we've discussed, is his kind of radical materialism, is what it's sometimes called, which is to say that he essentially invented the theory of atomism, that is to say that the world is made of atoms. It's not quite, I don't know, our modern view of chemistry, but there are remarkable kind of moments. And so essentially what he would like to do is he has a view which he owes to Epicurus, who's a Hellenistic Greek philosopher, and he would like to explain everything in our world in material terms. And as the result of that kind of explanation, he feels very strongly, that we really shouldn't be concerned with religion, that religion in general has negative consequences. His famous example is the sacrifice of Iphigenia, but also that there probably are gods, they're material, but they're not bothered by us because we're just like a tiny little part of the world. But he also, and very powerfully, and this is sort of why I'd recommend Stephen Greenblatt, argues that because of the radical materialism of the world, we shouldn't care about death. And his famous expression is that death, therefore, is nothing to us. And his argument essentially is that if you believe Epicurean philosophy, you no longer worry about any of that because you realize the kind of transience of your life. It's a very funny philosophy because essentially it's saying that there's no afterlife, we don't have to care about that, and yet we should be relaxed. And I think one of the most powerful things is that Lucretius, for whatever reason, ends his account of this world, which is called On the Nature of Things, which is to say the entire universe, with a very close version of the Plague and Thucydides. And the last lines are this, and I might just read them, and we might use this just to think about the sort of the virtue of this kind of thinking for us. So he says, for indeed by now the religio of the gods and their godhead was not counted for much. The grief of the moment overwhelmed it all. Nor did the old rites, most of burial continue in the cities, which aforetime this people had ever been wont to be buried. For the whole people was disordered and in panic, and every man sorrowing buried his dead, laid out as best he could. And to many things the sudden calamity and filthy poverty prompted men. For with the great clamoring, they would place their own kin on the high piled pyres of others and set torches to them, often wrangling with much bloodshed, rather than abandon the body. And that's the end of this poem. And it's such a sort of striking end that some people have thought that the poem couldn't have been finished. But I just wonder if this might reflect prompt a couple of reflections on the power and the sort of peril of thinking about plagues and what plagues can mean for us as a sort of, as a way of thinking about the past and as a way of thinking about our place in the world. And obviously, in a way, it's a sort of luxury to be able to think about past events because they don't materially affect us. But I also think there's a sort of power to that. Sorry, that's a bit of a rambling sort of prompt.
I'm going to change back to the gallery view so we can have more of a sense of our conversation as we close here.
I guess one thing I would say as you're sort of thinking is that at Bard, we teach a course for first-year students called the First Year Seminar. And for a while, Lucretius was on this text. And the students that I read that text with were very frustrated and puzzled by this ending, in part because I think they had been sort of, they had been attracted to Lucretius's worldview, and they'd found it in a way very powerful. And so Stephen Greenblatt, who has not paid me, I've never actually met, although I saw him in the library once, writes really beautifully about the power of Lucretius for him as a young person to kind of deal with the difficulties of life, to deal with his own mortality and the mortality of the people that he knew. And so it struck me that one of the kind of radical questions that we have to ask is this plague a kind of admission by Lucretius that in the face of really terrible disasters, we simply cannot maintain our kind of ataraxia, which is to say our calmness, our undisturbedness? Is it a sense that reading his philosophy, we're able to cope with the most terrible human disasters that we could? I mean, what are we supposed to do with this really terrible and radical ending, if that makes sense? Those are sort of two ways of thinking about it. One is that the philosophy is so good, so powerful that we can deal with it. The other is that There's no philosophy that can answer the kind of really terrible human costs of the situation which we find ourselves in. I'm not sure that I have like an answer either way, but I just thought I would give you guys a chance to sort of respond a bit to that or to anything that we've said.
Yeah, doesn't it bookend the he starts out with Alma Venus and the beauty of Venus and spring and birth and so forth, and then in the middle, there's Epicurus saved us from all this horrible religion that caused Iphigenia to be sacrificed, and then here at the end there's sort of a final, I want to say, a final blow to religion being the savior of mankind. In the end, it's sort of Hobbesian, don't you think?
I mean, one way of reading it is precisely that, is to suggest that if the real target of Lucretius is not to improve our lives, but is to attack ancient religiosity, that might be one way of explaining it, is to say that in a sense the poem sort of tries to undo one's religious beliefs. I still think if you're trying to find a kind of solace in the poem, I appreciate I'm not saying that in any way I disagree with you, but it still is a bit unsettling, I think, that, yeah, Bill, your hand was.
I'm just going to say it's a great ending if you want to ensure your immortality.
Say more.
Stopping it there, as Jack pointed out, brings it full circle. And it's the sort of ending that sticks in people's mind, that people talk about forever, which is what most ancient poets wanted. I suppose all modern poets want it too. You want, give them that hook. If you can't get it at the beginning, get it at the end.
So this is the kind of commercial reading of Lucretius, that in fact all the philosophy is just there to make him famous. And that even though he says that we shouldn't be concerned about immortality, you'd really like it.
He would. All poets sing for a reason. It's either immortality or gold.
I guess this is true. Excellent. Giorgio, your hand was up.
Yes, as already mentioned, the start with Venus, he ends with plague. It's in a way the two elements that disturb the human beings and keep them away keep them, or not allowing them to reach, the core of the Epicurean philosophy, fear, lust or desire and fear. And he starts with desire, he finishes with fear. And I think again, what I felt compelling in Lucretius' passage is how helpless the human beings were, the Athenians were, all of them. And not only helpless, but he I can't say cruel, but he was really so sobering even about the medical profession. So the way I think he says, like, muttered in silent fear, medicina. It's almost disrespectful to the profession, but shows, let's say, the boundaries and the constraints perhaps of the pre-Epicurean people who could not have mastered the situation. That was
and to just sort of follow up very briefly. So on the one hand, I really like the kind of thread that's developing, that in a way the poem begins and ends with two really strong obstacles to Lucretius's philosophy. One is desire, and one is this really strong fear of death. On the other hand, I suppose that if you, as an Epicurean, I don't think the philosophy would suggest that you should just give up, right? It's not a philosophy that encourages people, just because they're not afraid of death, to seek it. On the other hand, it strikes me that this sort of seeking medical attention is maybe part of a kind of clinging to or fear manifest, right? That even though sort of medicine is not useful for the Athenian plague, that there's a kind of desperate attempt to seek after it, which I find very powerful. I don't know if that sort of adds into your sort of idea, Giorgio, or not, that there's even though the sort of Epicurean philosophy will help us deal with this problem, the Athenians nonetheless are sort of seeking a different solution, which is not found in philosophy, but is found in practice or is found in the world, if that makes sense.
And aren't we now? We're therapontes agnoia, trying to treat this pandemic, with being ignorant of a lot of aspects of it. We're just trying to come to terms with it, on the basis of what we've seen before and what we learn as it progresses.
I mean, you're hitting on something that personally, if I can speak personally rather than academically, scares me about this moment, which is precisely that I think I at least am unaccustomed to modern science being at a loss. That in a way, before this, there are obviously so many problems in our world, but it's rare, I think, that we feel so helpless even in knowing what we should do, or if that makes sense. I know, in fact, I know that we should all stay inside, we should all wash our hands, we should all not touch our face, but in the sense that the kind of, it just personally, that's something that I think I at least find very unsettling that you've hit upon, Jack. Are there other thoughts that you guys have either about this or about Thucydides?
All right, that might be good. Oh, go on. Janet, you can have the last word here, the latest word.
We talked about gods, but now we are talking about nature is punishing us. So there is some kind of punishment. This is coming from somewhere that humankind is experiencing this now.
I mean, I don't mean to sort of compare nature to religion, but in a way, our relationship to both is very similar in that we're both in a position of ignorance about both, right? If you're a kind of Greek who doesn't understand how the gods are behaving, you see these sort of massive powers around you and you don't know how to respond to them. And I think you're pointing to something now, which is that equally, whatever our belief system, I think I at least feel that I'm kind of in a world where I don't quite know how to respond and I don't quite understand what's happening around me. And I think that's in a way what makes a lot of these passages very powerful. I think that the sort of struggles that you see are precisely those struggles. They're the struggles of people who are trying really hard to understand and come to terms with what's going on, but can't. That's a sort of dour note on which to end.
Yeah, well, those are our times for now. Thanks, Rob.
Well, no, thank you very much.
Helping us look more deeply into these texts.
Well, no, thank you.
I know
so
we'll
much.
keep thinking about. So,
So,
thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.